redo. You have to do from the conscious being, Purusha. Right?
Yes, Rangadhar.
Yeah. So, if all are ready, I'll start reading each sentence and we will see. So, I'm reading the first sentence. A conscious being, Purusha, is self as originator, witness, support, and Lord and enjoyer of the forms and works of nature. So, he is describing Purusha as a conscious being. Now, the conscious being in Purusha would be the personal aspect of the Brahman, the personal aspect. Whereas he is also saying it is the self. The self is the impersonal aspect. So, is the self, but the self as originator, witness, support, and Lord. It is possible to experience the self as impersonal. At that time, you feel it to be not the original originator of the world, but as something different. Okay? All these variations are possible in the spiritual field. So, Srinivas is saying you can consider the self. When you see it as a Purusha, it is possible to see it as the originator, because all action in the physical world, it is somebody who performs it. So 90% of the time, it is somebody who performs an act. So that is what you see. That's he mentioning that. The conscious being as Purusha is the Purusha, is the self as originator, witness, support, and Lord and enjoyer of the forms and the works of nature. Someone who is enjoying and is a Lord, obviously, is the personal aspect of the divine. And that's why the Purusha can also be so many different things. Like in the Gita, I am stressing the words because we shouldn't get confused. Okay? Here, Srila is very specifically mentioning the conscious being. That means the personal aspect. Okay? The impersonal aspect, you couldn't call it conscious being, conscious. It is something vast and impersonal. The individual sense is not there. So, support, Lord and enjoyer of the forms and works of nature. So, someone who is enjoying what he has created, or he creates something and enjoys it. Like a poet creates a poem and enjoys what he's doing. Okay, like a sculptor makes a sculpture and enjoys what he's doing. So, the self, when it realizes itself as the Purusha, sees itself as the originator of the world, the witness, support, and Lord and enjoyer of the forms and works of nature. Works of nature, everything in the physical world, whatever is happening, is created, that it is enjoyed. I'm reading the next sentence. As the aspect of self is in its essential character transcendental, even when involved and identified with its universal and individual becomings, so the Purusha aspect is characteristically universal individual and intimately connected with nature, even when separated from her. So we have to understand this in the right way, because he is combining all the opposites. Okay? So this is what we have to be very careful about. As the aspect of self is in its essential character transcendental, even when involved and identified with the universal. So, even when you have the experience of the cosmic consciousness, behind the experience, the transcendental is there, causing this universal consciousness and also individual becomings. We are not conscious of the transcendental in us, but it is possible to become conscious of the transcendental in us. Even if you don't see it, it is there in the background. That's what Sridhar is saying. So, even in a stone, which is the individual becoming, okay, the divine presence is there transcendentally. That's what he's saying. So the Purusha aspect is characteristically universal individual, not transcendental. Okay? The Purusha is universal individual. The Purusha can be universal, then you call it the self. You call it the witness. But it can also be the individual, then you call it the Purusha, the personal aspect of the divine. You see yourself as though you are originated in the divine. That's why he combined the two words, universal, individual. and intimately connected with nature, even when separated from other. When you are in the self, you feel yourself to be separated from nature. Your body, mind, life doesn't belong to you. You have come out. They are far away. But when you experience the self as a Purusha, the personal aspect, you start enjoying and you realize that there is a connection between yourself and your body, mind, life. Okay? There is a connection. So this so much of flexibility, na? That's what you have to understand. It's very difficult for the mind to accept all these things at once. That's why he's making it so clear that the standards of the mind are so different from the standards of the higher planes of consciousness. That's why he is using these words which can confuse you, but you must not be confused. Okay? The transcendent at the highest level excludes the universe and the individual. When you experience the transcendent consciousness, there's nothing else except that. The world doesn't exist for you, the individuals also don't exist for you. But when it comes down to the cosmic level, it is there in the background. That's what he's saying. Even when it comes down to the individual level, even in a stone, in a cat, dog, human being, the transcendental is there hiding in the background. That's what he's basically saying. And even when you feel yourself to be separated from the world, like in the Mayavada philosophy and the Buddhistic philosophy, it is really there a connection in the background which you don't see. That's what it is. The difference between essentiality and the surface. In the surface you may not see, but essentially they are all connected. Right. Now, when separation. For this conscious spirit, while retaining its impersonality and eternity, you could use the word self for that. Impersonality and eternity. Its universality puts on at the same time a more personal aspect. Okay? So that's what he's saying. Even when you experience that, it has the possibility of putting on a more personal aspect. There's a footnote, and we'll read that footnote. Okay? The Sankhya philosophy stresses this personal aspect. That's why they use the word Purusha Prakriti. In fact, the word Purusha and Prakriti comes from Sankhya philosophy. Okay? And also it is there in the Vedas also. The Purusha Sukta. The Purusha Sukta is the personal aspect of the divine who creates the universe. He is the one who creates the universe. And all the Brahmins in South India, I don't know about North India, but in South India, all the Brahmin children are supposed to make the Purusha Sukta by heart. And I had a student in he's a Pakka Brahmin, Anisha, very fine boy. He knew the Purusha Sukta when he was a little child, but he understood nothing of it, he told me. And then later on, now he has become a master of Sanskrit. He has passed his PhD, I think also he has done, okay, in Sanskrit, Pondicherry University. And he told me that now he understands the Purusha Sukta. So, the Purusha is simply saying the Sankhya philosophy stresses this personal aspect, which makes the Purusha many, plural, and assigns universality to nature. This is the Sankhya philosophy. So the Purusha is, Archanadi is Purusha, Yasmin is Purusha, Shilpa is Purusha, Jyoti Anand is Purusha, Sonki is Purusha, and Ranganath Raghavan also is Purusha. All the millions of human beings are all, the Purusha is there hiding in your body, mind, life. You don't see it, but it is there. That's a personal aspect. And assigns universality to nature. Nature is, this is Sankhya philosophy. It's not absolutely true, but the universe is mechanical energy in the Sankhya. And it is universal. In this view, each soul is an independent existence, although all souls experience a common universal nature. There is a basic difference between Advaita and Sankhya. Sankhya says Purushas are many, nature is one, Prakriti is one, the universe. Okay? But the Advaita says that Purusha and Prakriti, essentially there is only one Purusha who seemingly divides himself into millions and millions of individuals, and Purusha and Prakriti are always together at the highest level. Okay? at the lower levels, they seem to be separate from each other, but each one is always involved in the other. Even at our level, our Prakriti is throwing its images on the self, and the self is there also in the body-mind life. There is a physical Purusha, there is a vital Purusha and a mental Purusha. And there is also the higher mind Purusha. The Purusha can take many, many stances. Okay. So there is a difference between Sankhya philosophy and the Advaita philosophy. Advaita is talking of the essence. These people are talking of the superficial aspect. Both are true. Okay. Sankhya philosophy is given great importance in India. Because when you want to liberate yourself, you have to consider yourself separate from body, mind, life. That means you have to make a distinction between Purusha and Prakriti. Your consciousness is one, but your body, mind, life is something quite different. And you have to lose that false identification. Okay, so I come back to the text. So its universality put on at the same time a personal aspect. It is the impersonal personal being in nature from whom it is not altogether detached. Okay? Not altogether, but you can experience it as detached. That's the first experience in the higher mind level. You feel yourself to be separated from your body, mind, life. For it is always coupled with her. Nature acts for the Purusha and by its sanction, for its will and pleasure. Similarly, is describing the experience of the Purusha. Okay? When you see it as separate. So he is describing. It is not his philosophy. He is actually telling what is possible in the experience. Nature acts for the Purusha and by its sanction, for its will and pleasure. The conscious being, that is the Purusha, imparts its consciousness to the energy we call nature, receives in that consciousness her workings as in a mirror, accepts the forms which she, the executive cosmic force, creates and imposes on it, gives it or withdraws its sanction from her movements. So, the Purusha, when it separates itself from body, mind, life, it can experience it as the originator of the body, mind, life, and it is allowing. This is what we have to understand. We feel that the soul is absolutely divine from the essence. Essentially, it is divine. But when it is come down into the physical world, it allows Prakriti to do whatever it wants. Why does it do that? Why does it allow anger? Why does it allow greed? Because of experience. Only when you experience things, then you know its nature. So, in the beginning, you are allowed ego, ignorance, and you slowly understand the nature of this one. But then you realize that you are allowing certain movements which are limiting you. I wouldn't call them good and bad, but they are limiting you. So you learn to withdraw yourself from those limitations. That's the first movement. This Purusha withdraws himself from Prakriti. But then he realizes a little later that he is really connected with them. So he realizes that he is the permission giver, that I have allowed my own body, mind, life to have greed, anger. Okay, I am using negative terms, but even the positive terms also are the same. I have allowed my nature to be generous, calm. I can also say that. These are all features. But then you realize that you have given the energy and the impetus to it. So now you withdraw the energy and the impetus. Okay? This is something that all those who do karma yoga realize that. And then you realize that you are not doing anything at all. It is nature which is acting. Universal nature is acting for you. Okay. So, I read the next sentence. The experience of Purusha Prakriti, the spirit or conscious being in its relation to nature, is of immense pragmatic importance. For on those relations, the whole play of the consciousness depends in the embodied being. The embodied being is the individual when he is in ignorance. Okay? So, this is the very great in Sankhya, no importance between the relations to nature. No importance because you experience it as separate. But in the other yogas, you have to see that there is a connection. If there is no connection in the integral yoga, how are you going to control it? You can't control someone who has got no relation with you. So you have to establish the relation and then pour your influence on him. So they are connected in the integral yoga. Okay? Experience the Purusha, the spirit of controlling in relation to nature is of immense practical, pragmatic importance, practical importance. For on these relations, the whole play of the consciousness depends in the embodiment. Now he is explaining the different aspects. If the Purusha in us is passive and allows nature to act, accepting all she imposes on him, giving a constant automatic sanction, then the soul in mind, life, body, the mental, vital, physical being in us, becomes subject to our nature, ruled by its formation, driven by its activities. That is the normal state of our ignorance. We have actually, our soul has allowed us to do all these things. We are in ignorance. We are not aware of our soul. The soul has given permission, okay? But you are not aware of it. You feel that you are doing all these things. It gets replaced by the ego. You feel that you have a will of your own and you are doing all these things, but that's the ego, not the being, not the conscious being. Okay, so very clear what he is describing. When the Purusha gets involved in the body-mind life, it is in ignorance and it is thinking that it is doing everything. Okay? And the Purusha is passive, okay? And allows nature to act, giving permission to nature to act as it wants. As he said, anger, greed and egoism, if you want. Accepting all she imposes on him, giving a constant automatic sanction. We always justify ourselves. Then the soul in mind, life, body and mental, vital, physical being in us becomes subject to our nature. Now tell me one thing, why is he saying this? He is repeating. Then the soul in mind, life, body, but also the mental, vital, physical being in us.
So the Rangada Purusha.
Pardon?
The Purusha. These are the three Purushas, the being.
Yes, the inner being, that's it. You see, there is a surface mind and there is an inner mind. Right? And he is referring to that. So, then there is a vital, but there is also a pranamaya Purusha at the back. Okay, that's the inner being, which is much purer than the outer surface nature. Then you have a physical body, but there is also a physical Purusha, Annamaya Purusha. Okay, so you are not one, you are a complex of so many different. You have a surface mind, but you also have an inner mind. That's a Purusha it is talking about. Okay, so the mind is not Purusha. The mental Purusha, the inner mind, is much more powerful, and then, but that in ignorance, that also is disappears. That's what he's saying. Okay, so if the Purusha becomes aware, that we read. Okay, so since we are no longer involved, to accept or not to accept. Then he is saying, since we are no longer involved, but for it, where is it? This is the first step to the soul's freedom. If the Purusha in us becomes aware of itself as a witness and stands back from nature, first you are in ignorance, but now the Purusha realizes that I am not body, mind, life. It stands back from nature. That's the first step towards the soul's freedom, liberation, mukti. Because you are escaping from the prison house of body, mind, life. You are free, mukti, the soul's freedom. For it becomes detached. Now you are not identified with your body, mind, life. The soul feels that it is separate. And it is possible then to know nature and her processes, and in all independence, since we are no longer involved in her works, to accept or not to accept. You can accept or not to accept. When you say I don't want to accept, you say no to your anger, no to your greed, and no to your other things which you don't want. Okay, that's it. You are free. That possibility is there, but 90% of the time they are very satisfied with the peace and they don't want to interfere in the body, mind, life. The usual Indian tradition is only liberation. But Sridhar is saying when you are liberated, the possibility of controlling the lower is there. That's very clearly he is saying. Since we are no longer involved, to accept or not to accept, okay, that also is there. To make the sanction no longer automatic, but free and effective. So in the beginning, when you are in ignorance, your soul is automatically, it is obliged to agree to whatever the body, mind, life is doing. But when you separate yourself from your body, mind, life, you have the power to say no. That's what he's saying. But now, even if you allow your nature, your body, mind, life to have certain characteristics, it is with full freedom. You are not bound. It's not ignorantly that you are allowing, but you are allowing purposefully. That's what he's saying. That's the difference. Okay. So, we should, but free and effective. We can choose what she will do or not do in us. Or we can stand back altogether from her works and withdraw into the self-spiritual silence. This is what the Buddhists do. Or we can reject her present formations and rise to a spiritual level of existence, and from there recreate our existence. This is what Srinath wants. Don't be satisfied only by the higher mind liberation, but realize that you have a control over your body, mind, life, but the control is not full. So rise to a higher level of consciousness and get rid of your limitations even in the lower level of the physical being. That's what he's saying. Okay? So, which is not there in the Sankhya philosophy. The Sankhya philosophy says liberation is enough. Okay? We can reject the formation and rise to a spiritual level. Note that your power increases when you rise to a spiritual level. And from there, recreate our existence. The Purusha can cease to be subject, Anisha, and become Lord of its nature, Ishwar. Now, the word Anisha is very interesting.
It's come from Isha Upanishad. Isha. It is the Isha Anisha.
Yeah, Isha is Lord, Anisha is not Lord. When you are in ignorance, you are Anisha. But then he is equating it with Ishvara. Why? Because in Sanskrit, the possibilities are immense. Anisha can have two meanings. Yaha Isha Nasti, one who is not the Lord. But the other one is Yasya Isha Nasti. That means Isha, you don't have a Lord. Okay, that's the Anisha. So, first is Yaha Isha Nasti, the one who is not Lord. But the other one is Yasya Isha Nasti, that's a compound, the Samas. I don't have a Lord.
Bahubri.
Then what am I? I am the Lord himself. Because I don't have any superior being. So that's the word Anisha, very interesting word. This is the thing in Sanskrit all the time. It depends on the context. You have to interpret the word correctly. It's sometimes quite confusing, but you have to see in the context how it is to be used. Many
Rangada,
words.
that is why the Western Indologists make a mess of it.
Well, they make a message anyway. Okay, so the para is clear. Shall we go to the next para? In the philosophy.
Yes, I will read.
Yes, read. In the philosophy of the Sankhya.
In the philosophy of the Sankhyas, we find developed most thoroughly the metaphysical idea of Purusha Prakriti. These two are eternally separate entities, but in relation to each other. Prakriti is nature power and executive power. It is energy apart from consciousness, for consciousness belongs to the Purusha. Prakriti without Purusha is inert, mechanical, inconscient. Prakriti develops as its formal self and basis of action, primal matter, and in it manifests life and sense and mind and intelligence. But intelligence too, since it is part of nature and its product in primal matter, is also inert, mechanical, inconscient. A concept which sheds a certain light on the order and perfectly related workings of the inconscient of the material universe.
Yeah?
Just a sec.
You lost the text?
No, it is the light of the soul, the spirit that is imparted to the mechanical workings of sense, mind, and intelligence. They become conscious by its consciousness, even as they become active only by the assent of the spirit. The Purusha becomes free by drawing back from Prakriti. It becomes master of her by refusing to be involved in matter. Nature acts by three principles, modes, or qualities of its stuff and its action, which in us become the fundamental modes of our psychological and physical substance and its workings: the principle of inertia, the principle of kinesis, and the principle of balance, light, and harmony. When these are in unequal motion, her action takes place. When they fall into equilibrium, she passes into quiescence. Purusha, conscious being, is plural, not one and single, while nature is one. It would seem to follow that whatever principle of oneness we find in existence belongs to nature, but each soul is independent and unique, soul to itself and separate, whether in its enjoyment of nature or its liberation from nature. All these positions of the Sankhya we find to be perfectly valid in experience when we come into direct inner contact with the realities of individual soul and universal nature. But they are pragmatic truths, and we are not bound to accept them as the whole or the fundamental truth either of self or of nature. Prakriti presents itself as an inconscient energy in the material world, but as the scale of consciousness rises, she reveals herself more and more as a conscious force, and we perceive that even her inconscience concealed a secret consciousness. So too, conscious being is many in its individual souls, but in itself we can experience it as one in all and one in its own essential existence. Moreover, the experience of soul and nature as dual is true, but the experience of their unity has also its validity. If nature or energy is able to impose its form and workings on being, it can only be because it is nature or energy of being, and so the being can accept them as its own. If the being can become lord of nature, it must be because it is its own nature which it had passively watched during its work, but can control and master even in its passivity. Its consent is necessary to the action of Prakriti, and this relation shows sufficiently that the two are not alien to each other. The duality is a position taken up, a double status accepted for the operations of the self manifestation of the being. But there is no eternal and fundamental separateness and dualism of being and its consciousness force, of the soul and nature.
So, Srimad is describing the truth of Sankhya, and he's also saying that you can go beyond that truth to another level where it is not applicable anymore. It's a very interesting thing because we'll discuss slightly the Sankhya philosophy. The Sankhya philosophy says that Purusha and Prakriti are always together but always separate. It's like two friends. The two friends are not one. They are two friends, but they are always separate from each other, but they cooperate. And when they cooperate, there is creation. But when there is no cooperation, if you want, I'll explain that a little later, then there is no creation. That is exactly what happens when you go into the self. When you go into the self, you are in the Purusha consciousness and you are static. For you, there is no creation at all. All the creation is down there below in the world, but you are not, you are only watching it. There is no creation in you. You are absolutely static. That's what is described. It's very interesting para. We'll quickly go through. But before that, I want to tell you the truth of the how the Sankhya says Advaita is not right, because Advaita is saying that all human souls are essentially divine and one. So their argument goes like this. Now, suppose Gitanjali realizes the self. Have I realized the self? No. But if it is all essentially one, her realization would be my realization. So therefore they are all separate. So this is true at the higher mind level. So at the lower levels of spiritual consciousness, not ordinary consciousness, at the lower levels of spiritual consciousness, Sankhya is right. Because one can get liberation, but the others are not getting liberation. But when you go to the highest level, you see that your soul is really the soul of everybody else. So at that level, you can impart your experiences to others also. That's what Sridhar is doing, and Mother also should do. They, we know that famous experience of the Sridhar giving the silent mind to his Tamil teacher, but he could not take it because he is at a lower level of consciousness. He did not profit. He wanted to get lose it. There is also a very interesting example of the same thing with Ramakrishna and his nephew. His nephew used to attend to him as a personal servant. But one day that nephew told him, "You are going on giving so many things to everybody and so many are benefiting. Why don't you give me something?" He tried to explain to him that you are not yet ready. But he wouldn't listen. "Nana, you must give me something." So when it was given to him, he couldn't take it because he is at the lower level. He didn't want it. He rejected it. So this is also what happens very often in spiritual experience. When the higher being enters into you, your vital being impure does not want it. It rejects it. But when you are in a cosmic consciousness, the soul is up there, you feel yourself to be one with everybody. And that feeling oneself to be one with everybody can be in two ways. You feel the whole universe within you, okay? Or you feel yourself to be in everybody else. So I call these two the comprehensive consciousness and the apprehensive consciousness. When you see yourself in everybody else, it is the apprehensive consciousness. When you see the whole universe within yourself, you are comprehending, you are experiencing the whole within yourself. Okay? So the Sankhya philosophy is true at a certain lower level of consciousness. So Indra is saying that very clearly. So now we go back to the beginning of each of the para. Okay. With this background, it should be very easy to understand what he said. In the philosophy of the Sankhyas, okay, he has used the word Sankhyas because Sankhya is number. And the other day someone asked me, I don't know whether it was here, why Sankhya? Why the philosophy is called Sankhya? Because they break down the entire existence into 24 principles. First, there is the Purusha and Prakriti. Then Purusha and Prakriti create nature. Purusha and Prakriti, they create nature. And nature has got 5 elements. Okay, ether, air, fire, water, earth. Then each of the elements there is a characteristic to it. Okay, sound, sight, taste, hearing, and touch. So if you count all these, then from there you get the gross senses: eyesight, hearing, the eye, the ear, the tongue, and the skin, and what else? Sight, hearing, taste, touch and smell. I am forgetting smell. So these are all, if you count all these, it comes to 24 principles. That's why it's called the Sankhya philosophy. In the philosophy of the Sankhya, we find developed most thoroughly the metaphysical idea of the Purusha Prakriti, which is the first experience normally of those who enter into the self. These are two eternally separate entities, as I told you, like two friends, but in relation to each other. They are always together, but they are separate always. Prakriti is nature power, okay? Energy, Shakti, energy. An executive power, it is that which can execute and create. It is energy apart from consciousness. Consciousness separated from, at the highest level, consciousness and energy are the same. But at the lower levels, it is not so. So, you can see them as separate. They need not be separated. In fact, we use the Tantra uses the consciousness as energy. Okay, so there are different paths are there in different yogas. But here in the Sankhya philosophy, you see it as separate. Consciousness belongs to the Purusha. Prakriti without Purusha, okay, is inert, mechanical, inconscient. That's what you see in the physical world. We all see sunlight not being conscious. We see the river flowing, it is not conscious. The wind is blowing, it is not conscious. This is a mechanical force. That's what he's saying. This is what you see in the lower level. Prakriti develops as its formal self and basis of action, primal matter. Why is he saying primal matter? Because he's talking of the gross matter. Okay? Because there is a subtle matter in vital, there is an even subtle matter in mind, there is a subtlest matter at the highest level, which is Sat. So Swami is very, very clear. Okay? He's saying primal matter, gross matter. It uses as its basis of creation. Okay? And in it manifests life and sense and mind, okay? And intelligence. So sense, mind, and intelligence. Okay? They are the manas corresponds to the sense. The mind is the buddhi. The mind is chitta. So manas, chitta, and buddhi. They are the principles enumerated in the Sankhya philosophy. Manas, chitta, and buddhi. But intelligence too, since it is part of nature and its product in primal matter, is also in inert, mechanical, inconscient. In other words, your mind also is part of nature, part of unconscious nature. This is the Sankhya philosophy, a conception which sheds a certain light on the order and perfectly related workings of the inconscient in the material universe. This is an interesting phrase, what he's saying. This is a conception which sheds a certain light on the order and perfectly related working of the inconscient in the material universe. He is referring specifically to the workings of nature in the plants. Okay, the plants always seek water and light. Okay, so if you plant a tree on the footpath, it will go towards away from the wall. Okay, why? It is seeking light. If you take a potted plant and turn it upside down, do you think it will keep growing downwards? No. It turns up and goes up again. Why? It needs light. In other words, there is consciousness hiding in Prakriti. That's what Swami is saying. Okay? Perfectly related workings is exactly that. The animals, the instinct of animals also is the perfectly related workings. Okay, so we can make a note of that. This is my tab, the new tab. So I will I'll do that later. Add comment. So here instinct, wrong. Instinct. In animals and plants seeking light and heat. This is the two things. So this we will say. So this is what he means. It's interesting. I think I told you once, but it's very, very interesting how the plant seems to be mechanically doing its action. But no, there is a seeking in it. There's a consciousness. Okay? I think I told you once, but I repeat it because I found it fascinating. We had built a underground tank in the press. Okay? A big water for collection of water in the underground. And there was a tree growing on the surface of the courtyard. There was a tree growing. Then one day, after some time, somebody said, let's clean the tank because the tank has not been cleaned for a long time. When they opened and went into the tank, they found that all the walls of the tank, okay, were completely filled with the finest of roots. That tree had sensed that there is water there and it had pierced the concrete walls and sent its roots into the tank so that it could extract water from there. Now, is this not consciousness? So, even in that which is seems to be mechanical, unconscious, there is a consciousness. That's what Srimad is mentioning. A conception which sheds a certain light on the order and perfectly related workings of the inconscient in the material universe. It is the light of the soul, the spirit, that is imparted to the mechanical workings of sense mind and intelligence. They become conscious by its consciousness, even as they become active only by the ascent of the spirit. So they are establishing the connection between spirit and matter. The Purusha becomes free by drawing back from Prakriti. In other words, your soul, when it separates itself from its body, mind, life, becomes free. It becomes master of her by refusing to be involved in matter. I have nothing to do with my body, mind, life. And then that's what it is. Now, on the other hand, nature acts by three principles. What are the principles of nature? Sattva, Rajas, Tamas. Modes or qualities of its stuff and action, which in us become the fundamental modes of our psychological and physical substance. Note, okay, Tamas corresponds to the body, Rajas corresponds to the vital, and Sattva corresponds to the mind. That's why he's using both the words. So he's saying psychological and physical substance. So psychological, Tamas is laziness, vital is activity, mind is capacity to think, but also physical substance. The body, the vital, and the mental, the brain, okay, and its workings. The principle of inertia, Tamas, principle of kinesis, Rajas, and the principle of balance, light, and harmony, Sattva. When these are in unequal motion, action takes place. When they fall into equilibrium, she passes into quiescence. In other words, when your consciousness goes up and becomes static, it is free from the body, mind, life, there is no creation for you. You become inactive. Okay? There is no creation for you. You are not doing anything. That's what is meant. You realize that you are not doing anything. That is meant by quiescence. Purusha, conscious being, is plural, not one and single, while nature is one in the Sankhya philosophy. Purusha is plural. Just now we explained why. Because if you get liberation, I don't get liberation. So Sankhya is right at the lower level. Okay? It would seem to follow that whatever principle of oneness you find in existence belongs to nature. But each soul is independent and unique, soul to itself and separate, whether it is enjoyment of nature or its liberation from nature. Whether it is identified with body, mind, life or not, it is always separate from other souls in the lower levels. All these positions of the Sankhya we find to be perfectly valid in experience when we come into direct inner contact with the realities of the individual soul and universal nature. But they are pragmatic truths. Note, they are principles are true, but at this lower level. And we are not bound to accept them as the whole or the fundamental truth either of self or of nature. Because when you go to the highest level, you see even mechanical nature as divine Shakti. Okay? That's the chapter, Brahman Purusheshwar Maya Prakriti Shakti. So at the highest level, that which seems to be mechanical and unconscious energy turns out to be the Shakti of the divine. Then, Prakriti presents itself as an inconscient. Where's it gone? Yeah. Prakriti presents itself as an inconscient energy in the material world. But as the scale of consciousness rises, she reveals herself more and more as a conscious force. And we perceive that even her inconscience conceals the secret consciousness. So too, conscious being is many in its individual souls, but in itself we can experience it as one in all and one in all its essential existence. So this flexibility you must keep in your mind. At every level, the experience is valid at that level, but not necessarily so at the higher level. We've got 3 minutes, we'll finish the paragraph. But the experience of the unity is also its validity. Although each soul feels itself to be separate, which is a fact. My soul is not your soul at our level. But when I rise in consciousness, I realize that essentially we are all the same. Okay? If nature or energy is able to impose its forms and workings on being, it can only be because it is nature or energy of the being. And so the being can accept them as its own. There is a separation and yet there is a oneness. That's what we say. If the being can become Lord of nature, it must be because it is its own nature, which it had passively was during its work, but can control and master even in its passivity. Its consent is necessary to the action of Prakriti, and this relation shows sufficiently that the two are not alien to each other. The more you rise in consciousness in the higher planes of consciousness, you realize that you have the power to change your lower nature. The connection keeps on growing. But the power also keeps on growing, but the power is not absolute until you reach the supermental. In the supermental, your power becomes complete over matter. That's what I'm saying. The duality is a position taken up, a dual status accepted for the operations of the self-manifestation of the being. So self-manifestation, the universe and the lower levels. Then the duality is valid. But there is no eternal and fundamental separateness and dualism of being and its conscious force of the soul and nature. They are one at the highest level, they are separated at the lower level. That's what he's saying. Okay. So, we stop here today and we can, next week, we'll have to take up. Now, the page is 365.